Dear friends and colleagues, welcome to our monthly appointment with the Linguistic Flash Mob. Tonight, our two distinguished guests are Susanne Wurmbrand from the University of Vienna and David Pesetsky from MIT. The topic they discuss tonight on the basis of our usual 3 questions is at the same time a classic and a recently very well debated research topic, namely complementation. Tonight's moderator is Emanuela Sanfelici from the University of Padua. As usual, for security reasons, the chat, microphone, and screen sharing functions have been disabled during the debate, but the chat will be active at the end for you to write if you intend to ask a question, and we will enable your microphone. Those of you who won't be able to ask your question can send them to me via email to the following address, ceciliapoletto@gmail.com, especially those who are following us on YouTube, and I will collect the questions and send them to the speakers for a later reply. And one last announcement before we start. Today, the Linguistic Flash Mob is 1 year old. We are very happy that the initiative has been so well received by all of you and hope that you will contribute to the general discussion also in our next sessions. And now I leave the floor to tonight's moderator.
Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. On this special occasion, namely, as Cecilia said, the first birthday of the Linguistic Flash Mob, we decided to celebrate by discussing one, but actually probably the classical topic in syntax, namely complementation. So I was thinking about an introduction, and then I realized that it would have taken me too much time, and so I decided to be brief. Complementation has been densely investigated in a vast amount of research by many scholars, dealing with different phenomena, such as the distinction between finite and non-finite complement clauses, different size and types of complements, extractions out of complement clauses, the left periphery, and so on. Exciting results and important developments in our understanding of complementation have been reached in the last 60 years. Yet, various phenomena and various aspects of complementation still remain puzzling. Of course, to discuss all of them, we will probably need many more flash mobs. Therefore, to make the best out of one single flash mob, we individuated 3 broad but specific issues related to complementation, namely clause size, raising and control, and finally, the nature of complementizers. And tonight, these 3 issues will be addressed by 2 of the most prominent scholars working on the topic of complementation, namely Susie Wurmbrand and David Pesetsky. I will just start, and I will then propose the first question, namely a comment on clause size and related phenomena. Susie should start.
Sorry, I'm trying to share my screen.
Perfect.
All right, hold on a second. I'm gonna go full screen. All right, so David and I decided that we are not gonna do this as a battle, but just in case, I brought 2 seconds, Iva Kovac and Magdalena Lohninger, who have been involved in this quite significantly as well. All right, so the first question, clause size and related phenomena. I will actually be talking a little bit about general questions about complementation that I'm interested in, and I want to give you the very brief answers here already. Are there universal properties of complementation? Yes, there's an implication of semantic hierarchy, predictable mappings between morphology, syntax, and semantics. To some degree, I'll actually suggest a partial autonomy of syntax, but there are some implicational relations which I return to in question 3. And the relation between the matrix verb and the complement clause, I'll suggest what I call a synthesis approach, where the relation is not one directional, but actually 2 directional. I want to start with the implication of semantic hierarchy. In the typological works, and here in particular Givon, this hierarchy suggested, don't worry about the details here, obviously there's no time for that, but the idea is that complement clauses differ in terms of the independence or dependence they have from the matrix clause. So a speech verb is very independent, or the complement of a speech verb, whereas implicative verbs are very dependent or more dependent. Now, in work with Magdalena Lohninger, we have suggested that we can actually define three broad semantic complement types, which we define as propositions, situations, and events, but of course acknowledging that there's finer grained distinctions possible, and I'll come back to one in question 3. Now, the kind of issues that arise from this kind of hierarchy are cross-linguistic variation, the ontology of the Ich, so this implication of complementation hierarchy we call Ich. For German speakers, that makes sense. Then the modeling of the implication relation and the mapping between Ich and the syntax. As for the variation, when we look at syntactic or morphological independence properties, Smiths, then we can see quite nicely how the universal and the variation part can be modeled here. The universal parts are that Smiths operate along the Ich, and they cannot go against the hierarchy. But the variation, like with all implicational hierarchies, is that the properties may be neutralized and that they can have different cutoff points on the hierarchy. The universal that we suggested is that classes are defined by the meaning of the complementation configuration, so the verb and the complement together, but that verbs can change meaning based on the morphosyntax of the complement. And lastly, there's a certain degree of vagueness in the categories, and I want to in particular mention that the edges that we suggested here can be sort of fuzzy, and there's some very interesting recent work by Shannon Bryant, who argues that strong epistemic verbs in Oromo may actually be situation complements. Now, as for the ontology of the Ich, we adopted Wurmbrand and Svinonius' view that we can classify a clause in 3 broad clausal domains that correspond to conceptual primitives, so conceptual sorts, events, situations, and propositions. There may be an alternative, which Friederike Moltmann recently suggested, but I can't really get into this. And in Wurmbrand and Lohninger, we suggest that complement types can be classified in exactly the same way. Now, how can the implication of relation be modeled? Here we assume containment following Wurmbrand and Svinonius. Situations are elaborations of events, and propositions are elaborations of situations. And that gives us a classification that complement types have different minimal requirements. So an event requires just a data domain, a situation, a TMA domain, and the proposition, the entire clausal domain. If we now move towards the syntax, translating this into structure, we can immediately transfer this to the same containment relations in structure, namely minimal structures which stand in an implication of relations, and that's given here. CP domain, TP domain, and voice domain, and the 3 classes yield these implicational relations. Now, there is no one-to-one syntax semantics mapping. That's the first part of the autonomy of syntax that I'm going to suggest here, and also a further cross-linguistic variation part. What has been observed cross-linguistically is that complements can be larger than needed. So all of this has been suggested that even event complements can actually, in some languages, project up to CP. That is up to variation, and in some languages, this is actually highly this preferred. Now, from that, I want to bring up just one sort of putting this all together, one thing that can be phrased as a debate, and that can be put in terms of how is this hierarchy implemented. And I'm distinguishing here between 2.5 approaches. The small approach, which is what I've been following, is that clause building simply stops at one point. The big approach, which I gather David will be talking about, that we always have a full clausal domain and then structure is removed or exfoliated. And then there's a hybrid approach where there is minimal contentful structure, but added deficient or semantically vacuous structure. And I think actually most approaches have some version of this building. From that, we actually get different questions. So the first question is the same for both approaches. How is the implicational relation, the implicational nature derived? And then we get different questions. For the small approach is what determines when the clause building can stop, whereas for the big approach, it's what regulates the amount of structure that's removed. So it goes basically in the opposite direction. And the second question for the small approach, what is the most motivation for building additional structure? As I told you, there can be additional structure in some languages. And for the big approach, it would be what is the motivation for the initial building of full clausal structures, in particular when they are vacuous. So here, this is sort of my final point here. I'm only giving you the answers for the small approaches. I don't want to presume answers for the big approach, but I suspect that they will be very similar, which I consider actually a major achievement, even if we have different modeling ways of doing this. I think this is the part that I think probably, hopefully, that we may agree on. So containment and minimal structures basically derive the implicational nature of the ish. Synthesis, this is what I mentioned at the beginning, that determines when the clause building can stop. So synthesis, the view is quite simple. A syntactic structure is computed relatively freely. There is no selection, but the output has to be interpretable and meet the restrictions of the parts. So this is shown here, very abstracting. If a verb has property X, then the complement is most likely an XP, but it could also be a YP as long as it still has property X. So as long as the meaning still comes out the same way, the structure could get bigger in this approach. And for the independence properties, I'm not going to say much other than that whatever diagnoses a larger structure in a language could actually be seen as the motivation for building additional structure. All right, thank you.
Thank you very much. So now the floor is to David.
Thank you. Let me share my screen, see if it works. Yeah, this is a problem with notability on my iPad. So let me try to get back in there. Sorry, everybody. Give me a second. There we go. Hopefully. Good. That's visible to everybody?
Yes.
Okay, good. So thank you. It's a privilege to be here, and it's a privilege to be on the same platform with Susie. Indeed, we're not really battling. I hope our work ultimately, when it comes to its conclusion, is complementary because we're talking about closely related but distinct topics. Indeed, I'm going to talk a little bit about material that's in this manuscript of mine called Exfoliation that's on Lingbuzz. And at the heart of it, this big theory, as he called it, is a core, what I think is a core generalization about clause size, a generalization that's been staring us in the face really for a long time, but somehow we haven't realized it. I know I didn't realize it. That extraction of the subject across a clause boundary makes the clause smaller, whether that's by a movement or a bar movement, and where the smaller output may be as small as a non-finite clause or as large as a complementizer list, but still finite clause, or something in between. So for example, in English and many other languages, but not all, a raising of an embedded subject requires the embedded clause to be infinitival. It certainly cannot be a full finite clause with a complementizer. But a bar movement of an embedded subject also requires the clause that it moves out of to be smaller in English. It does not have to be non-finite, but it has to be missing the complementizer layer. That's the so-called that trace effect. And I'm not aware that these two phenomena have been brought together in this fashion before. A paper by Karstens and Dirks mentioned some data from a Bantu language, Lusamia, that essentially shows this that trace effect for a movement where hyperraising of an embedded subject is possible out of a finite clause, but the complementizer has to be missing, much as in the A-bar examples in English. These all seem to instantiate the core generalization that you move the subject out, the clause has to shrink. And though I'm not going to go into it here, it's quite possible that anti-agreement, recently studied from a very different perspective by Nico Bayer, instantiates the same property. You A-bar move the subject, and the embedded clause has to lose stuff, may remain finite, but loses some of its inflection. So this is the core generalization that I think is teaching us something, and it raises a number of ancillary questions. Are clauses ever smaller for any other reason? That's what Susie's final slide touched on. What do we mean by subject? What do we mean by makes? Right? And what determines how much smaller? So the answer that I give in this manuscript to the question, are they ever smaller for any other reason, is no. But there's much to discuss here. And the evidence is that starred configurations traditionally attributed to the caselessness of the subject of an infinitive, I argue, are actually instances of illegal clause shrinkage, illegal infinitivization, because the subject was not extracted. This dovetails with the question of what we mean by subject, which turns out to be any element that's moved into the domain between little v and c. And the evidence is that the illegal infinitivization paradigm holds of non-nominals that are not canonical subjects. What do we mean by makes? So I argue in this manuscript for a strongly derivational interpretation of clause shrinkage. It has that property in common with Gerrion Müller's work, that all clauses are built as a full and finite CP, and then are stripped of one or more of its outer layers by a rule of exfoliation. The evidence, which I'll touch on very briefly, are certain derivational opacity effects. And what determines how much smaller is how high the subject raised within its clause. That exfoliation strips away just enough outer layers to place the subject at the edge of what remains. The relevance of this is a question of whether the result is a full infinitivization or some degree of anti-agreement or loss of the complementizer alone. So the argument that we need to say that clauses become infinitives only for exfoliation type reasons can be seen in paradigms like two, traditionally attributed to case theory. On the exfoliation approach, an example like 2E is bad because Sue didn't move anywhere, in contrast to a raising to object construction like 2A. And we see exactly the same data, quite strikingly, with subject-like elements like fronted predicates in this paradigm, or locatives and locative inversion, as in this paradigm, which is evidence that the same paradigm holds of non-nominals, so case can't really be at issue, that are not canonical subjects. Right? And I could present similar arguments for clausal subjects and for expletive there. The argument that there's a process going on here that we're dealing with something strictly derivational comes from derivational opacity effects. So already in a previous slide, I showed you an example like 3A, Sue considers even more important than linguistics to be the fate of the planet. And in traditional case theory, there's a real puzzle as to why the fate of the planet is good in the first place. What's licensing it to pass the case filter? Likewise in 3B. So such considerations have led some to entirely abandon the case filter concept and agreement with T as a source of nominative. And as usual in syntax, Icelandic makes the problem even more acute. It makes all problems more acute. In Icelandic, we have well-known constructions like those in 4, where you see agreement and nominative case correlating on a direct object of a verb that takes a quirky subject. And famously, you get exactly the same nominative, even in a raising to object infinitive, where in a traditional theory, there's no obvious source of licensing for the nominative, much less any reason why it should be nominative. This really led some to entirely abandon the case filter and agreement with T as a source for nominative. But from an exfoliation perspective, I'm almost done, the licensing of the post-verbal nominal and the presence of nominative morphology is a residue of an earlier derivational stage during which the embedded clause was full and finite. And in fact, there are even anti-agreement effects that show up in these constructions where you're not seeing any agreement, first studied by Martin Everard, that you see in 5. That is, you cannot have a reflexive in this nominative position. You have a pronoun instead, as if there were agreement. And on the exfoliation theory, there used to be agreement before the clause was infinitivized. I'm going to skip over the unification to that trace effects because I'm a little bit over my time. But so this is one way of capturing this core generalization, which has built into its logic that at least to a great degree, smaller than full clauses have to be produced by exfoliation. They can't be allowed to be freely produced in some other way, which raises a number of issues with respect to the work that Susie and her colleagues have done that are discussed briefly on this slide, but I'm over time, so I'm going to stop. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Actually, perfect timing, both of you. So let's move to the second question. The second question touches upon the notion of raising and control. So, David?
So I should not have stopped sharing my screen. Sorry, 1 second. Let me capture it. Hopefully we won't have the same problem, but if we do, I know what to do. We have the same problem, and yes, I know what to do. Hold on a second, everybody. Sorry. Back to this. All right. And I have my own personal timer. Let me just reset it so I know what I'm doing here. Sorry. Okay. All right, so raising and control. So I think, at least based on our previous conversations, Susie may be talking about possibility that there are control-like phenomena that don't involve an actual controlled element. So I'm not going to be talking about that at all, but limiting my discussion to control that involves a syntactically realized controllee, a pro, something of the sort. Questions arise in an... Sorry, I just lost my screen for myself. Are you still seeing my shared screen?
Yes.
Okay, so let me just, I'm sorry, forgive me for that. I just accidentally touched something there. Now I'm seeing it too. Okay, so questions arise, starting with why control in languages like English entails non-finiteness or other sorts of smaller than full clauses in other languages, if non-finiteness exclusively results from exfoliation. So the subject must have raised out of CP. But the question is why and to where? So there are at least 2 possibilities. One is control as movement, that the embedded subject raises to the controller position. And the other, which might not occur to you quite as rapidly, is that the subject might be undergoing short movement out of CP, but into some kind of superstructure built above the CP layer. So I'm not going to talk about the movement theory of control. Those of you in Europe are probably familiar with the Dreyfus cartoon by Carandache that begins, let's not talk about the movement theory of control. And then in frame 2, it says they talked about it. So I'm going to skip over that because reasons that are clear from the cartoon. Though, of course, if control is movement in some cases from controllee to controller position, infinitivization is predicted by what I told you about a moment ago. So let's talk about the superstructure idea. So in the manuscript on exfoliation, I have a discussion about the famous English for element, as in for Mary to leave the room. And I try to argue that we have an infinitival clause here, not because for is some kind of complementizer, but because it's actually a head built above the CP domain that has raising to object syntax. There are other features of the diagram here that I don't have time to talk about, but the key thing is that for attracts the subject out of the CP just a short distance, triggering infinitivization just as in other raising to object constructions. This accounts, among other things, for the fact that adverbials cannot come between for and the subject. Here it's not for some case adjacency reason, but because the subject raised, the subject moved higher than these adverbials. And it's a fact that many non-implicative and non-factive control constructions share semantics with the English for infinitive. So in a superstructure like the one suggested for English, for might be present in at least this category of control infinitive, with the raising of pro into the for domain, the cause of infinitivization by exfoliation. Whatever your theory is of where the subject moves, the exfoliation proposal, interestingly, I think, makes right predictions about the clause internal syntax and movement patterns in pro itself. So as Chomsky and Lasnik, in what got published as the first chapter of Chomsky's Minimalist Program book, noted that pro behaves like other nominals with respect to movement and considerations that for overt nominals, they were in the habit of thinking of as case theoretic. Namely, it looks like, so in an exfoliation theory, this follows straightforwardly. The pro receives nominative case, pre-exfoliation from finite t, just like any other nominal, passes the case filter as a consequence. In a language like Icelandic, it can sometimes trigger nominative concord. Michelle Sheehan and Jutta Hartmann talked about this at a conference last December. So the data that motivated a special theory of null case in this work is sort of straightforwardly handled in a theory in which derivationally controlled infinitives start out their life full and finite and become infinitivized by the raising of pro. So that's what the exfoliation theory has to say about pro versus raising, not getting into the detailed questions about exactly what is the right theory of where the subject moves in these constructions. Thank you. Susie.
Thank you very much. So then it's Susie's turn.
All right, so raising and control, there is really a lot to be said about, but what I want to do is to maybe take a step back and ask some of the more fundamental questions, namely the shared labor of syntax and semantics in control, whether control is necessarily syntactic, and here it doesn't matter whether it's raising or pro, and related to that, the debate of whether control complements or properties or propositions. Now, I want to look at constructions that have been a little bit less studied, but I think they bring so these phenomena they bring possible new insights for control in general. In particular, I'll be talking about object to subject promotion across control predicates, known as long passive and cross control, which is also collaborative work with Elena Paul and Lisa Travis and Josina van der Klok, backward control without movement, and it could be extended to implicit exhaustive control, work that Eva Kovac has been doing recently, but I won't be touching on this here for time reasons. Excuse me. So from an English perspective, this may sound weird, but constructions like the banana was tried to be eaten, the banana tried to be eaten, the banana was tried to eat, are found in many languages with the meaning that someone tried to eat the banana. And here you see all the languages that we have collected data so far from. What's going on in these constructions? So here you see again the abstract English just glosses. An object is promoted to matrix subject, and the meaning is still a control structure where the trier and the eater have to be the same. Now, in terms of the morphology, what's found cross-linguistically is that there is some morphology corresponding to object promotion, such as passive or patient voice, on either of the verb, or in some languages on both of the verbs. And once again, this is all has the same kind of meaning. In terms of the syntactic properties, there are two that are relevant here. These kind of long object dependencies are only possible with exhaustive control predicates. And it can be shown that there is no embedded syntactic subject argument. There may be a clitic in some languages, but this is the syntactic configuration. So there is no pro or DP, and that in a sense enables and maybe even motivates promotion of the object to the subject. So the question that we are supposed to answer here is raising and control. And this kind of construction is actually both raising and control at the same time, although the thing that's raised is not the same as the controller. So there's something raised, but then we have an obligatory semantic control relation where the understood agent of the matrix predicate has to be identical to the understood agent of the subject, the embedded predicate. There's various ways of achieving this kind of dependency. It could be a lexical semantic rule, it could be some kind of incorporation, or it could be a voice dependency or some kind of binding or agreement relation. The other construction I want to mention here is some very exciting work by Asha Pietraszko, where she shows that in the Belle control constructions, the subject can appear in the embedded clause, but it still triggers backward control. What's important, though, about this language is that it does not involve movement, neither overt nor covert, nor an agreement dependency. Instead, it's argued there that the control dependency is derived via some semantic index binding or index agreement. So in terms of the shared labor question, syntax needs to provide the configuration for a shared semantic subject without actually projecting an actual subject. The subjectless predicate must be compatible with the subject, so unaccusatives are impossible, for instance, and some form of syntactic dependency between the predicates takes place, such as index binding or voice sharing. And in semantics of exhaustive control verbs, semantics identifies the matrix and embedded agents, even when they're implicit. So this leads to a hypothesis, and this is very hypothetical. I don't feel too attached to this yet, but I think it's something that should be considered. So pro or movement approaches cannot easily derive these configurations. Given that semantic control must be an option in grammar, even if it's not noticeable in certain constructions, a possible direction would be to actually derive exhaustive control always semantically. This would not entail that globally there is no pro or never movement in backward control. It only means that it would not be necessary for the interpretation. There may be extra syntactic factors that require these. And this could lead to a different classification of control. So this is sort of a typical control classification, although there's various slashes and brackets because people have different views. But exhaustive control could be seen as a semantic dependency, and then partial control and non-obligatory control could actually involve different syntactic elements. All right. Should I leave my screen on?
Yes, please. So now we move to our last question, and the question is about the nature of complementizer.
Okay,
please.
Thank you. There is so many things one could say about complementizers. What I will be narrowing in here are certain semantic properties of complementizers, a selection of syntactic properties, and then something about finiteness and complementizers. There has been a very productive research on semantics of complementizer-related phenomena. I've just given a summary here: interrogative semantics with all sorts of additional phenomena, indexical shift, logophoricity, binding, pronouns in general, control, decay, evidentiality, commitment, speech act differences, quotations, direct, indirect, mixed discourse, etc. And a trend is that the CP actually involves finer-grained distinctions, but distinctions that go beyond the original cartography, so not just information structural projections. Instead, following works by Spies and Tenney and other work like Alessandra Giorgi and Martina Wilczko, the CP is assumed to involve speech act and speaker addressee information. And I've given a summary here. Dayal looks mostly at WH constructions. The labels, as you can see, obviously differ, but I think there is actually a significant overlap here as well. Krivka has suggested a speech act phrase, commitment phrase, judgment phrase. Deal looks mostly a shifted indexical shift. Very cool new work by Jack Rabinovich from Harvard. He suggests, based on Munchie indirect discourses, an utterance phrase, force P, etc. And Sandhya Sundaresan has argued again for speech act and addressee-related information, including perspective here. Now, this is sort of the finer-grained distinction of the proposition domain that I mentioned in the first question, and differences between different types of predicates that take different types of complements can actually still be handled in the same way by a truncation of these kind of projections. Moving to the syntactic properties, It's of course well known that A dependencies like raising, ECM, and I'm also including agreement here, are often restricted to non-finite complements. And there's a common view that ECM or raising are smaller than finite clauses. What I have been working at, again, together with my team, is that there are really a lot of languages where we do find cross-clausal A dependencies across finite CPs. I've given here a summary of raising, ECM, and agreement, where it has been well established that there is some kind of raising or A dependency across a CP boundary, and the embedded clauses are true CPs. Now, there's many things one can say about these dependencies, but there's one approach which may be relevant for the nature of complementizers. So one option for regulating the possibility and impossibility of finite A dependencies is to follow the view that CPs are not exclusively A-bar domains. Kuhn and Bill and van Oork have suggested that a single head can have both A and A-bar features, and that from that there's a mixed A-bar property that these heads have, so the complementizers, and that carries over to the things that move there. So if in a language C has or also has A features or A properties, movement qualifies as A movement, and further finite A movement is predicted to be possible. There are other CP-related syntactic correlations that have been pointed out in the literature. Hans-Martin Gärtner, for instance, has shown that if a language has WH infinitives, then its pronominal system does not have a robust indefinite interrogative ambiguity. Magdalena Lohninger, in very recent work, shows that if in a language WH movement is A movement, following Richards, then it allows A dependencies across finite clauses. Sabel has a correlation between WH infinitives and complementizers, and very detailed work with looking at many more languages. Denis Satik has shown that there's also a correlation between tough constructions and infinitival complementizers, WH infinitives, and the pronominal system. Okay, so the last area I want to touch on is finiteness. There's two views, perhaps, that one can isolate. One is that finiteness is solely a property of the CP, like a fin head, and that means that the lack of CP essentially entails the lack of finiteness. The second view is that finiteness is not restricted to the CP, but the lack of finiteness does not entail the lack of CP does not entail the lack of finiteness. David Adger has suggested that, and in work with Neda Todorovic, I have also argued for that. Why have we suggested that? The reason is very simple, that in Serbian, all types of complements can be finite. So you have da plus an inflected verb. Yet, the complements show typical ich effects, which already has been pointed out by Stepanovic. So exactly as predicted by the ich, finite complements differ regarding a range of properties, and those include long passive, overt subjects, clidy climbing. There's even experimental evidence that shows that clidy climbing out of finite complements is possible in Serbian. Another reason has to do with the typological work on finiteness. The typological conclusions are rather grim. There's no finite, non-finite distinction. There's no uniform cross-linguistic definition of finiteness. Finiteness is not an elementary syntactic notion, and there's no single morphosyntactic definition of finiteness, nor a single semantic function associated with it. Now, the last point I think is probably right, but one could still provide a more abstract definition, such that finiteness is really a language-specific morphosyntactic property that distinguishes free from dependent clauses. And in addition, I think there are, even if one believes the typological work, there's still exciting things to be said about finiteness. And one such thing that I have been found exciting, which is still hypothetical, but in work with 5 wonderful co-authors, we have looked into finiteness in the South Slavic languages, and first of all, cross-linguistically, all types of complements can be finite or non-finite. So there can't be a simple semantic definition for finiteness. And you see here the distribution in the South Slavic languages. And what you do see here is, although there is a lot of variation, that we can nevertheless see a clear implicational relation, which is that event complements are more likely to be non-finite, and propositional complements are more likely to be finite. And importantly, this is the kind of scale that I was mentioning that operates along the Ich. So there's no language where you can sort of swap where events are more finite than situations. All right, thank you.
Thank you very much. Then David.
Okay, I'm unmuted, yes? You can hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so I think what little I have to say on this topic is entirely complementary to what Susie has talked about. I interpreted the question a little more narrowly than she did, referring by complementizer to the head of the embedded clause, whatever it may be. So my short answer to the question, what is its nature, is that I truly haven't a clue. Obviously, there's lots of literature and lots of speculation and lots of talk about it, but I have nothing of my own to contribute on this question. But I do have some things that to mention that may be relevant. So, responding to the observations by Susie and her colleagues concerning correlations between clause size, other syntactic behavior, and semantics, some of which she mentioned right now, if one were to make it compatible with the things that I've been talking about previously, one possibility is that this reflects post-exfoliation semantic interpretation. And some of you may have heard a talk I gave in December at the Brussels conference. It's supposed to have been in Brussels, it was online, which is now also the final section of the latest version of the manuscript on LingBuzz, which might give us a slightly different way to think about this that I don't have time to go into here, but which might suggest a view, sort of a strictly syntactic view of what C is about, that it's the termination point of each act of clause building on the part of merge, or a termination point of a phase building, which might give us some clue as to why it exists in the first place, a kind of final symbol analogous in a merge framework to the initial symbol of Chomsky's earliest work on syntax. But I actually would like to end rather by talking about things that I know or problems that I feel I have a solution to. I want to actually end with some problems that I have no solution to, that I don't think have gotten much attention and should, and things I'm thinking about at the moment. So many of us are familiar with a sort of traditional Vergniaud-Chomsky case theoretic account of the distribution of clausal complementation that contrasts it with the distribution of nominal complementation, which correctly predicted, at least in a 1980s vein, that clausal complements, like nominals, should be acceptable as a complement to verbs, assuming that they're active and transitive, but not but that in contrast to nouns, which are disallowed, their clausal complements should be possible with adjectives and nouns. So we are sure that the earth is round, our demonstration that the earth is round. But a lasting puzzle of English, which is not a puzzle of languages that are otherwise rather similar to English, but it's a fact, and it's not a fact only about English, is that finite clause complementation to a preposition is not possible. We talked about that the earth is round is terrible, but as is known, if you move the that clause by a or a bar movement, it suddenly becomes fine. It's controversial, but I actually think it's true that that clause can be the subject of a finite or a non-finite clause. That's what you see in E and F. It's known but not well explained that clauses, but not in general nominals, can be extraposed and linked in some fashion in English, in standard English, to it, but not there. less well known, mentioned by Bresnan in her paper on locative inversion, that in the locative inversion construction, that clause is impossible. In this room was discovered for the first time that the Earth is round, is no good. And the reasons for that are really not known. Now, the distribution of four infinitives, I believe, is essentially identical in English to the distribution of that complementation, both the things that we felt once upon a time we could explain, and the things that, to my knowledge, we really don't understand, including the locative inversion fact in I there. That might be a strike against my view from the previous presentation that four clauses are not CPs, but are an instance of something else. Just want to end with a real striking puzzle that is relevant to some of the concerns that Susie talked about at the beginning of her presentation, not well known, which is if you examine embedded questions, they have a partly parallel but partly quite different distribution from that clauses and for clauses. Again, I'm limiting myself to English at the moment. So classic case theory predicts correctly that a embedded question should be possible as the complement to an adjective, a classically non-case environment. So we are curious how round the Earth is a fine question. But if you control for the right nominals to make sure you're not putting an embedded question in apposition to the noun, so you take a noun like curiosity, for example, our curiosity how round the Earth is immense, is really not good. You need to say our curiosity about how round the Earth is, which brings out another sharp contrast between embedded questions and that and for clauses in English, which is that they may be complements of prepositions. Once again, E and F show, perhaps controversially, I don't know, that they can be subjects of finite and non-finite clauses, but like nominals, but unlike that and for clauses, though they pattern with other clauses in the facts in G and H, they seem to be fine in locative inversion. So I think a proper understanding of what the head of a clause actually is going to have to include within it a full understanding of their external syntax, where they can and cannot occur. And surprisingly, for a field that's been worrying about this kind of question with respect to nominal complementation rather successfully, for a long time, as far as I know, the kinds of facts that I presented here, and we could extend them further in all sorts of ways, remain extremely poorly understood. That includes me. And I think that needs to be part of the agenda for trying to understand the answer to this question about which I deeply don't have a clue, which is why there are complementizers and what's the nature of the head of embedded clauses. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Super perfect timing. I think you gave us many insights to think about. You really clarified very nicely your commonalities and as well as your differences. And now I open the discussion. So Rita Manzini has a question. Please, Rita, if you want, you can unmute yourself.
Okay, so just to break the ice, it's actually a comment for Susie. So you gave us a list of languages with long passive, but I wonder why you didn't add Italian in view of those where restructuring, so-called restructuring. I saw Luigi some time ago, has that property. It's not the periphrastic passive, it's the C passive. But you can say things like, those houses were tried to build for the longest time. Queste case si sono provate a costruire. It's all perfect. It becomes perfect with other verbs, modals, and stuff. And this is the observation. And so basically, long passive is the essence, so to speak, of restructuring.
Can I answer this?
Yeah, but the question is another one. You mentioned the semantic operation, And now, perhaps I missed something, but would you call that semantic operation, which allows you to control in those environments? Would you call it predication? You mentioned Kierkegaard's thesis. Would you construe it the way Idan Landau does? Or so just a clarification on those points. I'm not asking David because you actually talked about slightly different matters. So.
Thank you, Rita. I just rechecked my slides and Italian is there. So I may have been wrongly alphabetized it, which is a common error I make, but it is certainly on the slides between Izbukun and Japanese. So it looks roughly right. So definitely Italian is part of it. As for the second question, we are currently working out the mechanism of the argument sharing, and it's actually not trivial, and there's various options. I am not sure that predication is the direction that we will be going, but it's still open. Instead, it really looks like something related to what Pietraszka suggested, namely some form of binding. She formulated it as index agreement, but talking to other semanticists, we have seen that the best way to model this is to actually have a binding relation where the matrix verb associates two of the arguments. But the details are not worked out, and everything is certainly an option, but predication alone is probably going to be difficult because we are also looking at cross control, which is the kind of configuration where you actually have the passive or the implicit relation in the embedded clause, and it's shared upwards, and that's very hard to do with predication. That's why we want a more like a C-command relation or a binding type of relation. But I'm happy to let you know once we have finalized this. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Then next question is Luigi Rizzi.
Yes, thank you. Actually, I have a question for both David and Susie. And the question is, what do you think of the generalization, at least something that was assumed to be a generalization a while ago, which is that all other things being equal, raising complements are smaller in size than control complements, right? So a generalization that manifests itself, for instance, in the fact that in many, many languages, you can have raising out of declaratives, let's say, but not of indirect questions. So something like John is unknown what to do, meaning it is unknown what John would do, is very strongly excluded in many questions. So there's an asymmetry there, and also there are various other manifestations like the fact familiar from the literature in the Romance languages, showing that control structures, sometimes with the same verbs, the equivalent of seem, for instance, has an infinitival complementizer when it's used as a control verb, but not when it's used as a raising verb, which suggests a difference in size. So I wanted to ask you both if you think that something like this generalization exists and how it could be captured in the systems you presented.
I'll go since talk last and then Susie. So that's a very interesting question. So in the exfoliation perspective, some of the cases have a natural, one of the cases you mentioned has a natural account, and others have an account, but maybe not, the facts aren't inevitable, right? So if extraction of the subject out of at least out of the preverbal domain requires clause shrinkage down to a level where the element being extracted is at the edge of its clause. Putting aside languages and constructions where C itself might furnish an A position, let's assume that that's not the case in English and Italian and the like, then the only way to get raising out of an indirect question would be to strip away the layers that contain the WH material, right? And there could be a number of plausible reasons why that's not possible. The hearer can't reconstruct the WH that was there, right? There could be a notion of criterial freezing that makes that impossible. So now if control is not uniformly movement, right, but simply requires that the subject be moving, some distance, so long as that distance is below the level of WH, right, then control into, infinitival question or infinitival relative clause should be a possibility. On the broader question of languages, like Idan Landau had a famous example of this from Hebrew, where the raising version of some construction has a clause peripheral marker that's obligatorily missing from the control version has a clause peripheral marker that's obligatorily missing from the raising version. That too can have an account, though perhaps not an inevitable one. So for example, if there is a 4 superstructure, right, that is that marker, say, right, but there's no semantically vacuous comparable structure that would permit a raising configuration, that would be a way of accommodating those facts. But then you could ask, why should there not be an appropriate marker that's also there for raising? And for that, I wouldn't have an obvious answer.
Okay, thank you.
Susie.
Thank you. So in the work on cross-clausal A dependencies, we have actually been looking into this, and you find this indeed, the WH phrases block agreement. So this has already been shown for CES, for instance, and in many languages also blocked A movement. Now, there's 2 ways to go about this. I mean, there's actually more ways to go about it, but given what I presented here, there's 2 ways to explain this. One is that once you have a WH phrase, then you uniformly type the CP as an A bar domain, and hence you cannot do A movement out anymore. So this is in particular, Magdalena Lohninger has sort of argued for that the CP has a lower A domain and then higher A bar domain, and you can only do this cross-clausal A dependencies out of a finite clause when the higher domain is missing. The other option is that, so going back to the works on CES and Turkish by Serkan Jena, for instance, that cross-clausal A dependencies often require a particular semantics, like a topic interpretation, and then that has to be at the edge, so to say. It has to be the highest element, and again, the WH elements on top of that would block the A dependency. As for your other question, I think for Italian, I think it's entirely expected, since you don't have finite cross-clausal A dependencies, that a control infinitives can grow up to a CP. I was talking about this, that CPs are possible as complements, control complements. But given that you cannot move out of an A bar domain for raising, perhaps you can't have the same type of CP, because again, you cannot escape the A bar domain of the embedded clause.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Then next, Sandhya Sundaresan.
Yes, thank you. Thank you both for a very interesting presentation. My question is actually for David, and let me preface this by saying that there's a very good chance that I just didn't understand because I came in a little bit late. So I'm interested in cases where markers of clausal finiteness don't go hand in hand with properties of subjecthood. And you talked about these kinds of mismatches. So where you have overt subjects and non-finite clauses, and you mentioned Icelandic, In languages like Tamil, the case is potentially even worse because in Icelandic you have quirky subjects, but in a language like Tamil you have structural case on the subject, which can differ from the matrix. So it's not a kind of inherent case that you can try to explain away a different ways. So because you were tying notions of non-finiteness to subject extraction, I'm wondering what you would say about cases like these where the non-finiteness doesn't go hand in hand with the presence or absence of the subject. And another empirical case I'd like to add to this is cases of obligatory control that Pilar Barbosa, Anna Zabolci, and also I have talked about where you have what looks essentially like obligatory control, but the controlled subject is overt. And this happens in cases of contrastive focus. So John didn't try for himself to eat the pizza, but for someone else to eat the pizza, that kind of thing. So that's my question.
No, that's a very good question. And what's the right answer for Tamil? I don't know. But there are a couple of things that might be relevant. So, first of all, my brief discussion about four infinitives in English gives one vehicle by which a clause might look non-finite, but have an overt subject in it, namely the subject moved a very short distance, right? So that there really was movement. Now, in English, I had a piece of evidence for that may be lacking in Tamil, or may just be false. Okay? Another possibility we're thinking about is that I talked in the presentation, and actually also in the manuscript, because I think I haven't actually added anything to it about this, but in terms of the generalization being concerning subject extraction or an extended notion subject, but in reality, anything moving out of the upper region of the clause looks like it generates, on the one hand, clause shrinkage, it triggers exfoliation, and opening up the possibility of derivational opacity, where you see, say, nominative or some other structural case assigned, arguably by an element that you're no longer hearing on the surface. And old work of Luigi Rizzi's actually gives an example of that sort that doesn't involve subjects at all, what he called the aux to comp construction, right? So particular sets of environments in which the auxiliary verb in Italian moves leftwards somewhere. He said it was to see, and it's infinitival or gerund, so it's non-finite in one way or another. And he showed that you nonetheless get nominative on the subject. In fact, he also showed that you get what he would now call an anaphor agreement effect in that position. And so if one were to analyze those cases as involving raising of the auxiliary not to see precisely, but out of the clause, again, into some higher domain, the subject could be still in situ and would show sort of nominative. Those would be two kinds of strategies I would investigate for trying to understand the phenomenon you talked about. I mean, there's a more, earth-shattering alternative earth-shattering within my own little world, right? Which would be to find a way to say that, it's not the case that smaller than expected clauses, that non-finite clauses and the like are always produced by exfoliation in general. Perhaps they can be directly generated, but we have to be careful, not to let air into the arguments that I gave, that in the English and related language cases, exfoliation really is the only way to produce the infinitive. And that's going to be a neat trick given everything else that I've done, but one can imagine ways of doing it. So you're raising a very important challenge to what I talked about.
Yeah, just very quickly, I think you're exactly right that if you sort of open the back door to saying that there are, multiple routes to non-finiteness beyond exfoliation, then you are sort of, that's sort of like a risky move and makes the argumentation less airtight. The only thing I wanted to say is that with the Tamil cases that I'm talking about, there's very clear evidence that the structures seem more or less the same with or without the overt subject. And they're typically like temporal adjuncts or adjunct control complements. There's nothing like a covert for or anything like that that might suggest that there is a special different structure when the subject is overt. But I think you did answer my question
One-
on
one
the
might
whole.
look
So,
at- One might look into a possible parallel with the aux to comp type constructions that Luigi talked about in Italian, though.
okay. Okay. All right.
The question
Thank
was
you.
to me, but
Yeah.
Susie, do you want to? Yeah, okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much. If there are no further questions, I have a question. Okay, Asia Petratsko.
I have to unmute her, but I can't find her. So
Asha, I think you can ask.
Hold on, maybe I can unmute her.
Okay, now I can. Thank you. I have a question about, I wonder what your thoughts are about clause size differences in languages in which complement clauses are nominalized. So these are problematic for even a standard selection-based account where the clause size or the category, whether it's a voice P, TP, CP, is determined by the selectional properties of the matrix predicate, because the external syntax of nominalized clauses is presumably always the same. It's a DP, for instance. But then this is a kind of, so in languages in which all embedded clauses are nominalized, we nonetheless observe the same patterns of variation in clause size. So raising predicates tend to have smaller complements than non-raising predicates. But then what we mean by smaller in this case is the amount of structure contained in the nominalization. So I wonder how your views on complementation, and my understanding is that you don't think selection is involved in any case, handles these cases. I think that the question is perhaps more for David. I wonder in particular what spares the nominalization layer in exfoliation, if that's what you would end up saying.
So perhaps this answer doesn't directly address the question, because there were some things you said that I maybe you'll want to repeat, but in a way, so the English variant of that, so gerund ing complements were actually sort of kind of a basis for my feeling more secure than I might otherwise have felt in talking about the analysis of four infinitives that I gave. So, it's a very common proposal that English ing gerunds, which have external distribution, well, those that have the external distribution of nominals, involve a verbal layer and a nominal layer above it of some sort. And the minute one posits raising of the subject out of the verbal more clausy layer into the nominal layer, I have some purchase on the non-finiteness of the gerund part, right? And then its nominal properties are coming from this outer layer of nominal stuff. So I don't know whether that's an appropriate way to proceed for the examples you were talking about. We were talking about raising and the like, right? I mean, it's also the case that at least in modern English, ing forms also participate in some raising constructions. The topic kept being discussed, those sorts of things. So does that address your question, or did you have something more particular in mind? Your microphone is, oh, you're muted. Right. Hold on.
Automatically blocks me from being able to unmute myself, but now I can. Yeah. So I think it answered my question in the sense that it reminds me of this possibility that that you could have a smaller structure without, right. So that there's this possibility the way you analyzed four CPs, right? So you could in principle say that there's a layer that stays, and that would be nominalization layer, which gives you the tool of deleting a piece of structure that is not the outermost projection.
Yeah, I mean, you want something in the nominalization layer to trigger movement out of the lower layer. And if that happens, we at least predict some kind of exfoliation.
Yeah. Thank you.
So I haven't looked into those things, but for my approach, I think what would be important to determine first is what the semantics of the nominalization is. So what the nominal structure adds to the semantics. If that doesn't really add anything other than a formal syntactic property, then I guess I would sort of proceed along the lines that whatever verbal part you have in the nominalized structure just is visible even on top of the nominalization, which we know in the noun phrase there's percolation all over, but the selection that's missing, so to speak, or is going across a nominal structure would be expected if the nominal structure itself is vacuous, or at least vacuous for the complementation types of relations.
Thank you. Are there further questions? Okay, then if not, let us thank the speaker for the wonderful presentation and thank all the discussants and the questions and so on.
Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you again for giving us the opportunity to do this. This was very interesting. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Cecilia?
At the end of each talk, we thank the whole organizing committee, our PhDs, our colleagues from the Linguistic Aperitif, and we generally announce our next talk, which, Elena, can you share the screen?
But before, Cecilia, let me do a thing, because to properly celebrate the first birthday of the Flash Mob initiative, I now invite everyone to unmute themselves and join me for into a powerful applause and a happy birthday jiggle to the Flash Mob, because we are celebrating our first birthday.
Bravo!
Happy birthday to you.
Happy birthday to you.
Happy birthday, Flash Mob. Happy birthday to us.
Okay, so we all see each other at the end of May with actually we have been talking a lot about voice, so next time voice is on. The two discussants will be Adriana Belletti from University of Siena and Artemis Alexiadou from the Humboldt University Berlin. The moderator is Francesco Pinzin. I hope to see you all in 1 month. Stay safe. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.